The year was 1854, and the Tennessee hills stretched wide and endless, a place where forests swallowed sound and roads vanished into shadows. Travelers who ventured too far off the beaten path often found themselves lost among ridges that looked the same in every direction. But in that same year, whispers began to grow around campfires and in taverns. Men were going missing, men who never returned to their families, men whose names disappeared into silence. Some said it was bandits, others blamed the unforgiving wilderness. Yet a darker rumor lingered in the quiet corners of conversation, never spoken too loud. Two women, sisters living deep in the hills, whose door was always open to weary strangers and whose hearth never went cold. Hospitality in those days was a sacred virtue, but the tale said their guests never left alive. Before I go further into this forgotten and disturbing case, if you are fascinated by hidden chapters of history and stories that were almost erased by time, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next journey into the shadows of the past. Now back to the hills. Life in Tennessee was never easy. Farmers bent their backs against stubborn soil, hunting was a necessity, and barter was the only way to keep households supplied. Every man and woman knew the land could be as cruel as it was generous. In this environment, trust between neighbors meant survival. Yet when travelers began to vanish, suspicion seeped into that fragile bond, poisoning the roots of community life. At the heart of these events stood Sheriff Jonathan Hale. He was a tall, broad man in his 40s, his hair dark but streaked with gray from years of chasing disputes across valleys and settling quarrels with steady authority. He had seen violence, and he had seen grief. But nothing weighed on him more than the cases he could not solve. Jonathan carried those unsolved mysteries like stones in his chest, each disappearance a personal failure. A widower for nearly 5 years, he raised his teenage son, Matthew, with a firm but loving hand, determined that the boy would learn both integrity and caution in a world that often punished the honest. Jonathan was respected, but respect did not shield him from doubt. People wanted answers, and when those answers never came, even the most trusted lawman began to look weak. He would sit on the porch of his modest home at night, lantern flickering beside him, listening to the distant sounds of crickets and the restless wind through the trees, asking himself how men could vanish into air. Then came the stories of the Whitford sisters, Martha and Eliza. Their names arrived in fragments, carried by travelers who had heard of a warm home where the bread was fresh and the beds were soft. For a moment, the image of such hospitality soothed suspicion. After all, women alone in the hills often relied on kindness to keep themselves safe. But Jonathan could not shake the unease that grew with every missing man. The tension pressed heavier each month. At church gatherings, women whispered about the faces of strangers they had seen on the road, faces that never reappeared. Merchants complained that their kin never reached Nashville. Letters arrived from Kentucky and Virginia asking about brothers who had set out across Tennessee but vanished before they reached their destinations. Jonathan rode miles through woods searching, but found little more than abandoned campsites and trampled earth that told no clear story. One evening, as he polished his rifle in the dim glow of his lantern, Jonathan whispered aloud, "Someone knows the truth. And I'll be damned if I let these hills keep it buried." Yet the truth remained hidden, like something buried beneath the soil of Tennessee itself, waiting for the right hands to uncover it. The unease of the missing would not rest, and neither would Sheriff Hale. For in the silence of the hills, darker answers waited, answers that would test not only his resolve as lawman, but his very faith in human nature. And it all began with two sisters whose door was always open. The Tennessee hills in 1854 were both a blessing and a burden. The rolling ridges offered fertile hunting grounds and thick forests that kept the winds at bay, yet they also brought isolation so deep that months could pass without seeing a stranger's face. Families carved their lives out of the land with rough-hewn cabins, split-rail fences, and small patches of corn or tobacco. Every day demanded labor, chopping wood, tending livestock, hauling water from streams that glistened in the morning light. The people who lived here clung to customs that tied them together. On Sundays, Church was not just a place of worship, but the heartbeat of the community. Men gathered outside the small wooden chapel to exchange news of crops and trade, while women swapped recipes and stories, their laughter breaking the stillness of the hills. Square dances lit up the evenings, fiddles echoing across barns, and even the sternest farmer would smile once the music began. Trust and hospitality were sacred. No traveler was ever supposed to be turned away. Yet beneath that layer of tradition, hardship lay heavy. Droughts could ruin harvests, wolves could thin herds, and a single harsh winter might leave families begging neighbors for cornmeal. It was a land where survival depended on one another, and a broken bond of trust could mean ruin. Sheriff Jonathan Hale carried these truths like a second skin. He knew that law in the Tennessee Hills wasn't written on paper alone. It lived in handshakes, in the spoken word of honest men, and in the unspoken promise that neighbors stood together. His duties were not just about enforcing order, but about keeping fragile harmony alive. At home, Jonathan struggled with his own burdens. Since the passing of his wife, his teenage son, Matthew, had grown restless, torn between respecting his father's authority and yearning for independence. One evening, as they sat at the table over venison stew, Matthew looked across at his father and asked, "Pa, do you ever think of leaving these hills, maybe heading west like so many others?" Jonathan set his spoon down, his tired eyes narrowing. "These hills are our home, son. We don't turn our backs on land that's raised us. Besides, the West has its own troubles. Don't think you can run from hardship. It finds you wherever you go." Matthew nodded but said nothing more. Jonathan could see in the boy's face the same hunger for adventure he himself had once carried. The sheriff wondered how long he could hold his son's loyalty before the world lured him away. Others around Jonathan filled his days with both support and challenge. Elias Carter, his young deputy, embodied eagerness without restraint. Barely in his 20s, Elias had a spark that sometimes bordered on recklessness. He believed in swift justice and rarely thought twice before speaking. Jonathan often had to rein him in, reminding him that law wasn't only about punishment but about fairness. "You can't go accusing folks without proof," Jonathan told him one morning as they patrolled the edge of town. "But Sheriff," Elias protested, "if folks are afraid, shouldn't we at least show them we're doing something?" Jonathan's voice was steady. "Fear makes people blind. It's our job to see clearer, not to add to the panic." Then there was Clara Bennett, daughter of the local innkeeper. Clara had a sharp eye and a sharper mind, qualities that made her indispensable when she helped her father keep records of travelers. She was quick to notice patterns, quick to recall faces. Her kindness toward strangers often revealed details others overlooked. Jonathan valued her insight, even if he would not yet admit how much he admired her quiet strength. For now, life in the hills moved in its slow rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the soil. Yet beneath the rhythm was an unease, like a note of dissonance hidden in a familiar tune. Farmers still worked their fields, children still chased each other through churchyards, and fiddles still played at barn dances, but in conversations whispered low, fear was beginning to creep in. Too many men had set out on the roads and never returned. Jonathan sensed it as clearly as the scent of rain before a storm. Something was stirring in the Tennessee Hills, something that would not let peace last much longer. The first to vanish were men who passed through without much notice, peddlers, trappers, and hunters whose lives already teetered on the edges of solitude. A peddler named Joseph McBride had set out with his wagon filled with tinware and cloth, bound for settlements farther south. Weeks later, when his family sent letters asking after him, not a soul in town could recall seeing him leave. His wagon was never found. Soon after, a pair of hunters disappeared, their camp discovered near a creek, rifles stacked neatly against a tree, but no trace of the men themselves. Sheriff Jonathan Hale kept each report close to heart, scribbling notes into a leather-bound ledger. At first he tried to reason it away. Men in these hills often vanished to start anew, debts chasing them or temptations drawing them elsewhere. But as the weeks stretched into months, he began to feel the knot of unease tighten in his chest. One evening at the Bennett Inn, Jonathan leaned against the counter while Clara polished a row of mugs. Her expression was thoughtful, her brow furrowed. "You're thinking on something," Jonathan said, his voice low. Clara looked up, her eyes sharp. I remember faces, Sheriff. Always have. 3 men came through this inn in the last 2 months. None of them left town by the main road. I know because I keep watch on the travelers. Helps Pa with the accounts. They were gone the next morning, but no one saw them ride out. Jonathan studied her, weighing the gravity of her words. Are you certain, Clara? Memory can play tricks. She set the mug down firmly. Not mine. One wore a red scarf. Another carried a silver watch he showed to everyone in the room. I don't forget details like that. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then you may have just confirmed what I feared. Across town whispers grew louder. Families wrote letters that arrived long after hope had faded, asking if loved ones had reached Tennessee safely. Replies came back grim. No sign, no clue, no word. For some, it was grief. For others, only another cruel twist of the frontier. Jonathan rode out often, scanning ridges and abandoned clearings. He found scraps, an old satchel torn open, boot prints pressed into mud that vanished among rocks, ashes of fires long grown cold. These traces left him with more questions than answers, and each unanswered question weighed on him like stone. Deputy Elias Carter burned with impatience. As the 2 men sat on their horses overlooking a wide valley, Elias shifted restlessly. We can't just keep waiting, Sheriff. Folks want answers. We should be riding harder, knocking on doors, pressing people for the truth. Jonathan kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. Press too hard, and you'll have every man and woman turning their back on us. Fear spreads quicker than truth, Elias. If we let it rule us, we lose the town before we even find our missing. But something's happening here, Elias argued, his voice rising. Something's taking these men. Jonathan finally turned to face him, his tone steady but sharp. I know. Don't think I don't feel it every hour of the day. But rushing without proof will only make us blind. The deputy bit back his frustration, knowing the sheriff's words carried weight, though the ache of helplessness gnawed at them both. Still, Jonathan could not escape the thought that Clara's observation was more than coincidence. Travelers came and went through the Bennett Inn, yet some of them never reached their destination. The town remained restless, the air filled with rumors. Some claimed wild beasts dragged the men into the woods. Others muttered about robbers who lurked on hidden trails. But in Jonathan's heart, he knew neither explanation held. Something far more deliberate was at work. And as the night fell over the Tennessee hills, the sheriff sat awake in his small cabin, lantern glowing, the silence around him as thick as the unease in his mind. The mountains had always been unforgiving, but now they seemed to be swallowing men whole. By the summer of 1854, the names Martha and Eliza Whitford drifted more often through the murmur of conversations in town. For years the sisters had lived in a cabin tucked deep in the folds of the Tennessee hills, a day's ride from the main road. Their land was small, a patch of corn and a modest herd of goats, yet their farm never seemed to suffer the scarcity that plagued others. Travelers spoke of their table always set with warm bread, stews rich with meat, and cider that tasted crisp even in the heat of July. On the surface, the Whitfords appeared to embody the very virtue that the hills prized most, hospitality. A stranger might find their door open, a fire already lit, and 2 women smiling as though they had been expecting company. Locals recalled stories of men caught in rainstorms who had emerged days later praising the sisters' kindness. Yet behind those words lingered a curious distance. Few from town ever visited the Whitford home. Jonathan Hale had heard the stories many times. Sitting on the porch of the Bennett Inn one evening, he listened as a group of farmers swapped tales. Those Whitford women, one said, puffing at his pipe, they're good folk. Always been generous. My cousin stayed there once, said he ate better than he had in a month. Another man shook his head. Maybe so, but I don't trust anyone who keeps to themselves that much. Ain't natural for women to live out there alone, never seeking help, never needing company. Clara, who was pouring coffee for the men, added softly, I've seen them once or twice when they came to trade. Polite enough, but there's something about their eyes, watchful, as if they're always measuring you. Jonathan didn't reply. He merely filed the words away, as he did with every whisper and rumor. His instinct warned him that truth often hid beneath layers of gossip, yet he knew better than to accuse without reason. The sisters' reputation was tangled, woven from threads of admiration and suspicion alike. Some in town swore the Whitfords were pious women, attending church on rare occasions, heads bowed, voices rising in hymn. Others muttered that they never truly belonged, that they were outsiders even after years in the hills. Deputy Elias Carter was less cautious in his opinions. One afternoon, as he and Jonathan patrolled the outskirts of town, Elias said bluntly, "Sheriff, I think those women know more than they let on. Too many strangers vanish after passing near their land." Jonathan reined his horse to a slower pace, his eyes fixed ahead. "Suspicion is not proof, Elias. You'd do well to remember that." "But don't you feel it?" Elias pressed. "Something about them doesn't sit right." Jonathan sighed. "I've felt unease, yes, but unease alone doesn't put chains on a person. Until we have more, we hold our tongues." The hills themselves seemed to conspire in keeping the sisters' secrets. Trails leading toward their homestead wound through thickets and rocky outcroppings, places where even seasoned riders might lose their way. Hunters sometimes claimed to smell wood smoke drifting from unseen chimneys, yet when they followed it, the scent vanished. It was as though the land itself swallowed the Whitfords whole, keeping them hidden. And yet, whenever the sisters appeared in town, faces calm, dresses plain, baskets filled with fresh produce, they were welcomed. They sold eggs and milk, traded cloth they had sewn, and moved among their neighbors with quiet smiles. No one could point to a single unkind word or selfish act, but kindness alone could not erase the unease that spread with every new disappearance. That contradiction gnawed at Jonathan most of all. He sat late into the night by his lantern, ledger open, notes scattered before him. "Respected, admired, yet feared," he muttered under his breath. "Which face is the truth?" The answer would not come easily, for the Whitford sisters wore their reputation like a veil, half light and half shadow, leaving the sheriff to wonder what waited beneath. The summer heat pressed down on the Tennessee hills like a heavy hand, and with it came an even greater weight for Sheriff Jonathan Hale. The longer the disappearances stretched unanswered, the louder the demands for justice grew. Families wanted closure, merchants wanted safety on the roads, and regional authorities began to question Jonathan's ability to keep order. Letters arrived from Nashville, terse and demanding. One carried the seal of the county magistrate, its words sharp. "You are to provide tangible progress on the matter of missing travelers. Continued negligence will not be tolerated." Jonathan read it twice by the dim lantern glow, his jaw tightening. Negligence. The word cut deeper than the paper it was written on. He was no negligent man, yet he had nothing but rumors and whispers to stand on. In town, the tension grew like storm clouds. Farmers spoke in angry tones outside the church after Sunday service. Mothers held their children closer, casting wary glances at strangers. Even the usually lively dances grew subdued, laughter replaced by murmurs about those who never returned. Elias Carter pushed harder with every passing day. The young deputy stormed into Jonathan's office one morning, slamming his hand on the desk. "Sheriff, how much longer do we sit here waiting? Folks are scared, and scared folks need to see action." Jonathan looked up from his ledger, steady and calm despite Elias's fire. "What kind of action do you suggest, Elias?" "Dragging innocent people into the square and branding them guilty without trial." Elias paced the floor, his boots striking hard against the wooden boards. "Not innocent. We both know there are people out there hiding something. The Whitford women, they're too convenient. Everything points their way." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Everything points nowhere, Deputy. Suspicion without proof is a dangerous road. Once we ride down it, there's no turning back." The two men stood in silence, the weight of their disagreement pressing between them. Elias's youthful frustration met Jonathan's seasoned caution, and neither could bend the other's will. Meanwhile, the outside world forced its way in. A merchant from Kentucky, known for hauling bolts of fabric and fine tools, vanished after crossing into Tennessee. When word reached the hills, outrage spread like wildfire. This man was not some nameless trapper. He was known, connected, expected to arrive at trading posts across the state. His disappearance could not be ignored. Jonathan rode to the Bennett Inn, where travellers often gathered before moving deeper into the hills. Clara was there, wiping down tables while her father tended the books. Her expression darkened when Jonathan told her of the merchant. "That makes 6 in as many months," she whispered, voice tight with worry. "People are beginning to think the hills themselves are cursed." Jonathan shook his head. "Not cursed. Men don't vanish into thin air. There's a reason, and I intend to find it." Clara studied him carefully. "Then you'd better hurry, Sheriff. Fear makes people turn on each other, and when fear takes root, it's near impossible to dig out." Her words echoed in Jonathan's thoughts long after he left the inn. He could feel the pressure mounting not only from his superiors, but from the very people he had sworn to protect. Each passing day without answers chipped away at their faith in him and in the fragile peace of the community. That night, Jonathan sat on his porch, the cicadas loud in the humid air. He watched the horizon fade into darkness and wondered how much longer he could hold the line between suspicion and proof. Elias wanted boldness, the people demanded results, and his own conscience urged caution. The three forces pulled at him like horses tied to different posts, threatening to tear him apart. But deep inside, Jonathan knew the truth was out there, waiting. The question was whether he could uncover it before fear consumed the Tennessee hills entirely. It was late August when the man stumbled into town, his clothes torn, boots caked in mud, and eyes wild with exhaustion. He gave his name as Samuel Doyle, a trader from Virginia, and his arrival set tongues wagging before he even caught his breath. He looked as though he had clawed his way out of the very earth, and when he finally spoke, his words dropped like stones into already troubled waters. "I barely made it out alive," he rasped, leaning against the bar at the Bennett Inn. "Those Whitford sisters, and they ain't what they seem." The room went still. Farmers, hunters, and townsfolk alike turned to listen. Clara froze with a pitcher in hand, her eyes locked on the man. Sheriff Jonathan Hale, who had been sitting quietly in the corner nursing a cup of coffee, rose slowly, his expression unreadable. "Tell it plain, Mr. Doyle," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "What happened out there?" Samuel swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he lifted the mug of water Clara had set before him. "I was riding through the hills, looking for a place to stay. Came on their cabin, looked warm, welcoming. They greeted me like kin, smiles, food already cooking, but something felt wrong. The windows had bars on the inside, and when they showed me to the guest room, I heard the click of a lock the moment the door shut. A murmur spread across the room. Elias, standing near the doorway, leaned forward, fists clenched. "Are you saying they trapped you?" Doyle nodded, his face pale. "They tried to. I heard them whispering outside. Thought I caught the scrape of metal like they were fixing the latch. My gut told me I'd never leave if I stayed the night, so I broke the window. Cut myself bad doing it, but I ran. Kept running till I saw the lights of this town." He raised his torn sleeve, showing raw scratches and fresh cuts across his arm. The silence was heavy. Finally, one of the older farmers muttered, "Could be he's just a drunk telling tales." Another man snorted, "Aye, maybe he lost his nerve sleeping in the woods and conjured up a story to cover it." But Clara stepped forward, her tone calm yet sharp. "And what about the men who didn't come back? What about the ones no one ever saw again? Will you call them drunkards too?" Her words cut through the doubt like a blade. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, no longer so quick to dismiss Doyle's account. Jonathan, however, kept his composure. "Mr. Doyle," he said evenly, "fear has a way of twisting shadows. Are you certain of what you heard?" Samuel met his eyes, desperation flashing in his gaze. "Sheriff, I know the difference between shadows and chains. I swear to you they meant me harm. If I hadn't run, you'd be writing my name in that ledger of yours." Jonathan studied the man, noting every detail, the ragged clothes, the raw wounds, the quiver in his voice. Whether Doyle exaggerated or not, there was enough truth in his terror to unsettle him. After Doyle was led upstairs to rest, Elias cornered Jonathan outside. "That's it, Sheriff. That's proof enough for me. We should ride out there tonight." Jonathan shook his head slowly. "It's testimony, Elias, not proof. One man's fear doesn't justify breaking down doors. If we're wrong, we destroy 2 women's lives and our own standing in this town." Elias's jaw tightened. "And if we wait, more men may vanish. Can you live with that?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. The weight of the question hung between them, heavier than the humid night air. Inside the inn, townsfolk whispered in low voices, torn between disbelief and dread. Some still scoffed, but many glanced toward the dark hills with unease. For the first time, a story had surfaced, not of men disappearing without a trace, but of one who had returned, shaken, broken, and alive. And his words, whether fully true or twisted by terror, could not be ignored. The morning after Samuel Doyle's warning, Jonathan Hale awoke before sunrise, his mind restless with unanswered questions. He had long carried suspicions, but now, with Doyle's testimony echoing in his ears, he could no longer ignore the shadows gathering around the Whitford name. Proof was still missing, yet something in Doyle's terror felt too raw to dismiss. By mid-morning, Jonathan and Deputy Elias Carter began their rounds with quiet purpose. They didn't ride toward the Whitford homestead, not yet. Instead, they visited townsfolk who might have noticed details others overlooked. Their first stop was the blacksmith, who remembered trading with one of the missing hunters. "He bought iron shot 3 weeks back," the blacksmith said, wiping soot from his brow. "Said he was heading north, never saw him again. I thought maybe he found better hunting." Jonathan jotted the note into his ledger. Each testimony added weight to the pattern. Men came through town, many bound for destinations north or west, and too often their trail ended somewhere between the Bennett Inn and the deeper hills. At the inn itself, Clara Bennett proved invaluable once more. She brought out her father's guest records, carefully kept in neat columns. Her finger traced names on the page. Here, Joseph McBride. Stayed 2 nights, gone on the 3rd. Then Thomas Harland, the fabric merchant from Kentucky. And here William Tate, the one with the red scarf I told you about. They all stopped here, Sheriff. But none of them was seen riding out. Jonathan leaned over the records, the weight of the evidence tightening around him. "And each of them, they mentioned stopping at the Whitford place?" Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Not always, but 2 of them did. William Tate bragged about how the sisters offered him cider, said he might rest there before pushing on." She looked Jonathan in the eye, her voice low. "I don't believe it's coincidence." Elias let out a sharp breath, almost triumphant. "There it is, Sheriff." A pattern, clear as day. Jonathan closed the ledger softly, his expression grave. "Patterns don't convict, Elias. They guide us, but they can also mislead if we lean on them too hard." Still, even as he spoke the words, Jonathan could not deny the unease clawing at his gut. The Whitford's farm was too prosperous for its size, their hospitality too abundant for their means. And their isolation gave them cover no other family in the county enjoyed. Later that day, Jonathan took to the saddle alone, riding the back roads near the sisters' property. He studied the trails, noting how easily a man could disappear in the thick woods that pressed close around their land. Birds fell silent as he passed, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. At one point he dismounted, kneeling beside a patch of earth where wagon tracks had pressed deep into the soil. They led toward the Whitford homestead, but faded into grass before reaching it. When he returned to town at dusk, Elias was waiting for him outside the office. "Well?" the deputy demanded, eyes blazing with curiosity. Jonathan brushed dust from his coat. "Signs of travel, nothing more." "That's enough to justify going in," Elias insisted. Jonathan's voice hardened. "No, it isn't. Not yet. If we act without cause, we become the very threat we're sworn to stop." For a moment Elias looked ready to argue, but he bit back his words. Jonathan could see the frustration simmering in him, yet also the loyalty. The boy was impatient, but his heart was right. That night, Jonathan sat again by lamplight, reviewing Clara's records, Doyle's testimony, and his own observations. Threads were forming, pulling tight, yet the knot of truth remained elusive. He knew he would need more than stories and suspicions. He needed evidence strong enough to break through both fear and denial. And though he would not admit it aloud, he felt closer than ever to the truth. The decision weighed on Jonathan for days, but by early September he knew he could delay no longer. Rumors, testimonies, and strange trails of evidence had led him again and again toward the same name. If he was to keep order, he had to look Martha and Eliza Whitford in the eye and ask the questions that had been burning in his mind. He and Elias rode at dawn, the mist clinging to the valleys as though reluctant to lift. The path twisted through oak and hickory until finally the sisters' homestead came into view, a neat cabin with whitewashed walls, a garden heavy with late summer beans, and smoke curling from the chimney. To the eye, it was nothing but a picture of humble prosperity, yet Jonathan felt his gut tighten as they drew nearer. The sisters greeted them with smiles that seemed too well rehearsed. Martha the elder carried herself with a matronly calm, her voice steady as she said, "Sheriff Hale, Deputy Carter, what a surprise. Won't you come in?" Jonathan dismounted, tipping his hat politely. "We won't trouble you long, ma'am. Just a few questions, if you don't mind." Eliza appeared behind her sister, younger but sharper in her gaze, as if weighing every word before it was spoken. "Questions, whatever for? We've done nothing but mind our home." Inside, the air smelled of fresh bread and apples warming on the stove. A quilt lay draped across the back of a chair, and the room was so tidy it seemed staged. Jonathan's boots clicked against the wood as he stepped further in, Elias lingering near the doorway, his suspicion plain. "We've had word of missing travelers," Jonathan began carefully, his tone measured. "Men who passed this way but never reached their destinations. Some mentioned stopping here." Martha clasped her hands, feigning shock. "Why, that's dreadful news. We've offered meals to weary riders, yes, but we've no knowledge of their whereabouts. Surely you don't think—" Eliza interrupted, her voice cool. "People disappear in these hills all the time, Sheriff. Storms, accidents, thieves. You can't lay that at our door." Jonathan held her gaze, searching for a flicker of unease. Instead, he found only a steady calm, unsettling in its composure. Still, he pressed gently. "One man claimed he felt locked inside your home." Martha laughed softly, almost pityingly. "Locked? Why, Sheriff, our doors are stout, because the woods are full of wolves and worse. A frightened traveler might hear the wind and imagine chains where there are none." Elias bristled, stepping forward. "You can twist words, but too many have vanished. Something here doesn't sit right." Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him. The sisters' smiles never faltered, but he could sense the tension beneath their calm. "Would you care for pie, Sheriff?" Eliza asked suddenly, retrieving a dish from the table. She sliced neatly, placing a steaming wedge on a plate and sliding it toward him. "Apple with cinnamon. You won't find better in these hills." Jonathan's stomach clenched. He glanced at the plate, the crust golden, the filling rich. But the thought of Samuel Doyle's trembling voice returned to him, the story of a locked room and whispered voices. Slowly, he shook his head. "Thank you kindly, but no." For a moment, the room felt colder, though the stove still burned. Eliza withdrew the plate without protest, yet something sharp flickered in her eyes. The visit ended with courtesy on the surface, but every word, every gesture had been laced with unspoken meaning. As Jonathan and Elias mounted their horses, Elias muttered under his breath, "They're hiding something. You felt it too." Jonathan kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I felt enough to know this isn't over." And though the cabin faded behind them, its tidy walls and warm chimney, the unease clung to Jonathan like the lingering mist. The ride back to town was heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. The encounter with the Whitford sisters had only deepened Jonathan's suspicions. Yet for all his certainty that something was amiss, the evidence remained elusive, slipping through his fingers like water. The town, meanwhile, was beginning to fracture. As the days passed, word of Jonathan's visit to the Whitford homestead spread through the streets like wildfire. The rumors were swift to follow. Some whispers hinted at the sisters' guilt, while others staunchly defended them, claiming that their hospitality had been misjudged. The community found itself divided, torn between fear and loyalty. At the local church, on a Sunday morning swollen with humidity, the divide was clear. The congregation buzzed with quiet conversation, eyes darting nervously. At the back, Jonathan stood with his son, Matthew, who kept his gaze fixed on the pulpit as the preacher delivered his sermon. The sheriff felt the weight of stares on his back, the judgment hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Father," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible, "are you sure about this? About them?" Jonathan's grip on the pew tightened. "I'm sure something is wrong, son. But I can't prove it yet." A heavy sigh escaped him as his eyes scanned the room. People who had once looked to him for reassurance now exchanged sideways glances, murmuring behind hands. Even the men who had once been his allies in law enforcement now avoided meeting his gaze. As the service ended and the crowd filed out into the sticky afternoon heat, the tension was palpable. Jonathan walked with Matthew to the front steps, where a small group of men gathered, their hushed voices cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Elias was among them, his face tight with frustration. "Sheriff," Elias said, the words clipped, "we can't sit here any longer. People are ready to act. They're scared. They want answers, not more talk." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "And what would you have them do, Elias? Rush to conclusions, accuse without evidence? They want justice. They want something to be done before more people disappear." Elias's voice was sharp, tinged with impatience. Jonathan paused, his breath heavy in the damp air. He understood Elias's frustration. The young deputy's idealism often clashed with Jonathan's more tempered approach, but there was truth in his words. Fear was a dangerous thing. It could spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Behind them, a voice interrupted. "Sheriff, you've got to do something. We can't let this continue." The man was Tobias Griffith, a farmer whose brother had been one of the missing. His face was pinched with grief, his eyes shadowed with anger. "My brother was a good man. He wouldn't just disappear." Tobias's words, laced with pain, struck Jonathan harder than he expected. He knew the man's grief was real. Each disappearance had left a hole in the community. But the sheriff also knew that action born of fear often led to irreversible mistakes. "We're working on it, Tobias," Jonathan replied, his voice firm. "We will get answers, but it will be done right, or not at all." The crowd muttered, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. As the group broke apart, Jonathan felt the heavy burden of their expectations pressing down on him. At the edge of the crowd, Clara Bennett lingered, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. She caught Jonathan's eye as he passed. "They're scared," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the noise. "And fear makes people do things they'll regret." Jonathan nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment. "I know. But I can't let them act on it. Not without proof." Clara studied him for a moment before responding, her voice soft but urgent. "Then you'd better find that proof, Sheriff, before someone else does something you can't undo." Her words hung in the air long after she had gone, and Jonathan stood for a moment, watching the town retreat into its uneasy quiet. It was clear now. The divide in the community was no longer just about the missing men. It was about trust, about fear, and about what would happen when that fear was allowed to fester unchecked. Jonathan knew that whatever happened next, the consequences would stretch far beyond the Whitford sisters' cabin. The following morning, Jonathan could no longer shake the feeling that he was being pulled closer to the truth, but it remained stubbornly out of reach. After the unsettling encounter with the Whitford sisters, the need for concrete evidence had never been more urgent. The town was growing restless, and each passing day without resolution added to the tension. With pressure mounting from all sides, Jonathan knew he had to find something, anything, to turn suspicion into certainty. He rode out at dawn, alone this time. The air was thick with humidity, the hills shrouded in a mist that clung to the trees like a blanket. His thoughts circled back to the Whitford homestead, the cabin so tucked away, the land so isolated. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that there had to be something hidden, some trail or clue that would lead him to the answers. As he neared the outskirts of their property, Jonathan slowed his horse, scanning the landscape. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet, no birds, no wind through the leaves. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath. He knew that the Whitfords' land was difficult to traverse, the trails weren't well marked, and the dense forest made it easy for anyone to lose their way. That's when he noticed it. Just off to the side, behind a thick cluster of brambles, A faint trail cut through the underbrush. It was narrow, almost invisible, but there. A trail that clearly wasn't used often, but one that had been marked recently. Jonathan dismounted and carefully made his way toward it, the sound of his boots crunching against the dried leaves sharp in the silence. His hand brushed against the rough bark of a tree, his eyes scanning for signs of human passage. The trail twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the woods. The air grew cooler as the trees closed in around him, the canopy above blocking much of the sunlight. Jonathan's mind raced with thoughts of what he might find. Was this some hidden path used by the Whitfords, a way to move between their land and the surrounding area unnoticed? He pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford to let his mind run wild with theories. He needed answers, not assumptions. After a few minutes, the path opened up into a small clearing. In the center, a pile of recently disturbed earth caught his attention. He moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Kneeling down, he brushed the dirt aside and immediately froze. There, half buried under the soil, were a few scattered belongings, fragments of clothing, a worn leather satchel, and a tarnished pocket watch. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He recognized the watch. It was a piece that had belonged to William Tate, the merchant who had disappeared several months ago. The realization hit him like a blow to the gut. This was no ordinary trail. It was a path that led to a place where the missing had been hidden, perhaps even buried. His fingers trembled as he carefully retrieved the items, his mind racing with the implications. The Whitfords' house was hiding something, and now he had proof that they were more than mere witnesses to the disappearances. They were the culprits. Suddenly, a rustling noise broke his concentration. Jonathan snapped his head up, instinctively reaching for the revolver at his side. The sound came again, closer this time. He tensed, his pulse quickening as he scanned the surrounding trees. Had someone heard him? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure step into the clearing. It was Martha Whitford. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something darker, recognition, maybe fear. Jonathan stood slowly, the pieces of evidence still clutched in his hand. He said nothing at first, simply watching her as she stood there, her hands clasped in front of her. "Martha," Jonathan finally said, his voice low and steady, "I found something." She didn't flinch, didn't move. Instead, she met his gaze squarely, the same unnerving calm in her demeanor. "I know, Sheriff," she replied softly. "I'm sure you have." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken tension. Jonathan could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, the certainty that everything was about to change. The questions were finally ready to be asked, and for the first time Martha Whitford didn't offer an answer. The moment Martha Whitford spoke, Jonathan felt the shift in the air, as if the entire forest had held its breath. She didn't flinch or back away when he confronted her with the evidence he'd found. Instead, her eyes remained steady, unwavering, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "I'm sure you have," she repeated softly, her voice calm but with a slight edge, as though the weight of his discovery had not caught her by surprise. "And what do you intend to do with it, Sheriff?" Jonathan's grip tightened around the items in his hand, the tarnished pocket watch pressing into his palm. The sight of it, the evidence linking the missing man to the very ground beneath his feet, sent a chill through him. But he couldn't let the sudden rush of certainty cloud his next words. He had to keep control. "I intend to bring the truth to light, Martha," he said, his voice steady though his heart raced. "I found this on your land. You knew who this belonged to. You knew about the disappearances." Martha didn't flinch, didn't look away. "And what exactly is it you think you found, Sheriff?" she asked, taking a slow step toward him. Her calm demeanor didn't shift, but there was a sharpness in her eyes now, a flicker of something beneath the surface. "I found proof that your home, your land, is where these men ended up. You knew what was happening here, didn't you?" Jonathan's words were biting, cutting through the cool air between them. For the briefest of moments, Martha seemed to soften, her eyes flicking down to the items Jonathan held in his hand. Then she looked back up at him, her gaze unreadable. "People can hide in the hills, Sheriff. It's not a crime to live off the land, to feed those who pass through. Jonathan frowned, pressing on. But it is a crime to trap them. To let them disappear into thin air with no one the wiser. Your hospitality— Martha interrupted him then, her voice growing firmer. You don't understand. You can't understand. You're looking for answers, Sheriff. And the truth is, you won't find it in these woods. Not if you keep thinking of it in the way you do. Jonathan felt a tension knot in his chest. What do you mean? Martha's lips twitched slightly as though she was suppressing a smile. The truth is never simple. We do what we must to survive, Sheriff, to protect what we have. She paused, and for a moment Jonathan saw the faintest flicker of something, guilt perhaps, pass through her expression before it was masked again by that cold calm. Protect what you have, Jonathan repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. By killing people who wander too close? Martha's expression remained impassive. Survival is never clean. People come and go in these hills, sometimes by their own choice, sometimes not. It's not for you to decide what happens on our land. Eliza appeared then, stepping quietly into the clearing, her face pale but determined. She was silent for a moment, watching the exchange between her sister and Jonathan. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Martha's, yet just as firm. She's right, Eliza said, her words quiet but carrying a weight of their own. You don't know what we've had to endure, what we've had to do to keep ourselves safe. The world out there, she gestured toward the hills, toward the open land that stretched endlessly. It's unforgiving. Sometimes we make choices we don't want to make. Jonathan's heart sank as he listened. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was something close, an acknowledgement of a darker truth he hadn't wanted to face. The Whitford sisters weren't just victims of circumstance, they were willing participants in something far more sinister. But still, he needed more. He needed something that could break the walls they had built around their defense. Tell me, Jonathan said, his voice hardening, how many men have you let disappear? How many of them ended up here in your care? Martha's gaze never wavered. None of them were innocent, Sheriff. You think we wanted to live this way? We did what we had to survive in a world that wanted nothing to do with us. Survive? Jonathan's voice cracked. You didn't just survive. You killed. But Eliza's eyes softened and she stepped closer to him, her expression pleading. We never meant for it to be this way. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Jonathan took a slow, steady breath, the weight of their defense pressing down on him. He was standing at the edge of something dark, something that threatened to pull him in, to drown him in a tide of fear and regret. He wasn't sure he could stop it, but he would try. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty. Jonathan knew the time had come to act, but the weight of his decision gnawed at him. He had gathered enough evidence, heard enough from the townsfolk, and seen the twisted threads that led directly to the Whitford sisters. Yet, despite the mounting suspicion and fear, he could not make an arrest without risking more than just the sisters' freedom. He could be jeopardizing the trust the town had placed in him. Elias was growing impatient. Every day that passed without action only deepened his desire for immediate confrontation. Jonathan could feel it in the way the deputy carried himself, his posture rigid, his eyes hardening with each passing hour. One evening, as they stood outside the sheriff's office, Elias voiced what had been on his mind for days. Sheriff, this waiting, this playing by the rules, it's going to get someone else killed. We need to move on them now. Jonathan looked at Elias, his eyes weighed with the burden of leadership. And what then, Elias? What happens when we burst through that door without real proof, when all we have is suspicion? We risk more than just the law. Elias clenched his jaw. You're talking about innocence when the truth's already staring us in the face. They're guilty. They've been killing people to protect their own lives. We both know it. Jonathan's voice was quiet but firm. You're right. I believe they're guilty, but I'm not going to throw everything away on an assumption. There was a long silence between them, broken only by the distant call of a bird. Finally, Elias spoke again, his voice softer but tinged with frustration. So, what do we do, Sheriff? Wait until there's another body to bury. Jonathan's gaze turned to the horizon. the last light of day casting long shadows across the hills. He knew Elias was right. Every day of inaction was another chance for the Whitfords to cover their tracks, for more lives to slip through their fingers. "I have a plan," Jonathan said at last, his voice resolute. That night, under the cover of darkness, Jonathan and Elias set their trap. They knew the Whitfords were careful. The sisters had avoided contact with the outside world as much as possible, relying on their isolation to protect them, but they also knew that no one could stay hidden forever. Jonathan sent a trusted man, a quiet local named Amos, to pose as a lone traveler carrying a satchel with valuables, a perfect lure for the sisters' hospitality. Amos was familiar with the area and understood the risks. He knew that getting close to the Whitfords was dangerous, but the sheriff had promised him that the operation would be discreet and controlled. As Amos made his way along the narrow path leading toward the Whitford cabin, Jonathan and Elias lay in wait, concealed in the trees. They had scouted the area thoroughly, positioning themselves in spots where they could hear but not be seen. Every muscle in Jonathan's body was coiled with tension, his mind running through every possible scenario. The minutes felt like hours as they waited in silence. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional movement of Amos in the distance. Jonathan's thoughts kept drifting back to the sisters, Martha and Eliza. What lengths had they gone to protect their secrets? How far would they go to maintain the facade of innocence? Finally, a figure appeared on the path, a dark shape against the backdrop of trees. Amos. He moved carefully as planned toward the cabin, his steps deliberate but not hurried. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched. This was the moment. If the sisters reacted as expected, the trap would spring, and everything they had been hiding would be exposed. But as Amos reached the door of the cabin, Jonathan's instinct screamed that something wasn't right. There was no sign of movement from within, no warm welcome, no creaking of the door opening. Instead, Jonathan felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The stillness was too complete. He motioned for Elias to stay low, and they watched in tense silence. Amos knocked again. Still nothing. Jonathan's grip tightened around his rifle. The silence was deafening, and the longer it stretched, the more uneasy he became. This was no ordinary standoff. This wasn't just about arresting the sisters. It was about uncovering a truth that was buried deeper than anyone had realized. And as the seconds ticked on, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched too. The minutes that passed felt like hours, stretching taut with the kind of silence that presses against the soul. Jonathan's eyes never left the clearing where Amos stood, his knock unanswered, the stillness deepening the suspicion gnawing at him. He felt the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. This was the turning point. If the trap didn't work, if the sisters were truly aware of the ambush, everything could fall apart. His hand hovered near the rifle at his side, fingers twitching with the urge to act, but he held still. He could hear the sound of Elias breathing beside him, soft and steady, but even that calm seemed fragile against the taut tension in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door of the Whitford cabin creaked open. It was Martha, her face obscured by the shadow of the doorframe, but Jonathan recognized her instantly. She looked out at Amos, who stood waiting, his posture rigid, trying to act as if nothing was amiss. The conversation was brief, too brief for Jonathan's liking, before she stepped aside to allow him entry. As Amos crossed the threshold, Jonathan felt a surge of frustration. They had expected a confrontation, an opening. Instead, the sisters had played their part perfectly, luring them deeper into their trap, keeping up appearances. Jonathan's mind raced. Were they planning to cover their tracks once more, or was there something more waiting behind that door? Without speaking, he motioned to Elias. They had prepared for this. As Amos entered, the two men silently moved closer, each step measured, each breath shallow. They had to remain unseen. The risk of tipping their hand too early could ruin everything. Jonathan's instincts were sharp as he inched forward, his eyes trained on the cabin, watching every movement. After a few moments, he heard the unmistakable sound of voices inside. Low at first, then rising, Martha and Eliza. They were speaking in hushed tones, But even from where he stood, Jonathan could make out the tension in their voices. They knew the trap had been set. The question was whether they were going to spring it themselves or continue pretending innocence. He motioned to Elias to circle around to the back of the cabin, while Jonathan stayed in position, keeping his eye on the front door. The quiet conversation continued, but Jonathan caught a glimpse of movement. Amos, who had been inside for several minutes, now came into view through a small window. His face was pale, his eyes wide with unease. Something had happened. The tension that had been building in Jonathan's chest turned to dread. He signaled to Elias, who quickly returned to his side, and they both moved with stealth toward the door. With a silent count, they advanced, their steps swift but measured. As they neared the entrance, Jonathan caught a word, just a single word, that sent a chill through him. "They're coming." The voice was clear. It was Martha speaking to Eliza, but the fear behind her tone was unmistakable. They weren't pretending anymore. Something had shifted, and whatever it was, it meant they had been caught. Jonathan didn't wait. He kicked the door open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall. Inside, the sisters stood frozen. Amos was backed into a corner, his hands raised in a futile gesture of surrender. Martha's face was pale, but her eyes were full of defiance, as though she had expected this moment. Eliza, on the other hand, stood at the far side of the room, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Jonathan with a mixture of fear and resentment. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The room was thick with tension, as if the very air refused to move. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice steady but heavy. "It's over, Martha. Eliza. We know what you've been doing. We know the truth now." Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward her sister as if silently seeking approval. Eliza nodded, just barely, and then the sisters shared a brief, almost imperceptible look. Martha spoke at last, her voice low but sharp. "You have no idea what it's like to survive out here, to protect what's ours from a world that wants to tear it apart. We did what we had to do." Jonathan's heart pounded as the words sank in. "You killed them? For what? To protect a life that's built on lies?" "Not lies," Eliza's voice cut in. "Protection. You wouldn't understand." The weight of their defense hung in the room, suffocating. Jonathan's mind raced as he processed their words, each sentence adding another layer of complexity to the truth they had buried beneath their twisted actions. They weren't just hiding their crimes, they believed they were justified, and that belief had made them dangerous. Jonathan took a step closer, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's over. The truth is out now." But even as he spoke those words, he knew the fight was far from over. The sisters weren't going to go down without a fight. And whatever came next, Jonathan was prepared to see it through to the end. The trial was set to begin on a crisp morning in mid-October. The town of Tennessee Hills, once serene and quiet, had become a battleground of opinions, filled with whispers of justice, fear, and lingering distrust. The arrest of Martha and Eliza Whitford had shaken the community to its core. Some still defended them, citing their isolation, their lives of hardship. Others, fueled by the pain of lost loved ones, demanded swift retribution. Sheriff Jonathan Hale had never imagined that his duty would carry such weight. As he sat at the front of the courtroom, the creak of the old wooden benches under the shifting of the townsfolk was a reminder of the magnitude of what was at stake. The room was packed, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The window was open, letting in the cool breeze of fall, but it couldn't clear the tension that hung thick in the room. Martha and Eliza stood at the front, shackled and composed. Their faces remained eerily calm, their expressions carefully controlled. The sisters had never once faltered in their defense, maintaining that they were simply protecting themselves from a world that had forgotten them. They had been isolated, abandoned by society, and they had only taken what was necessary to survive. Jonathan observed them closely as they were led to their seats. Martha's eyes were sharp, unwavering, but there was something else, something darker in them that only Jonathan had seen in moments when the mask slipped. Eliza, on the other hand, seemed almost resigned, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the coming trial had already taken its toll. The judge, a stout man named Judge Parker, called the room to order. His voice echoed in the courtroom, settling the chatter to a hushed murmur. "We are gathered here today to determine the fate of Martha and Eliza Whitford, accused of the murders of several men who have gone missing in these hills. The evidence presented will dictate whether justice is served or whether these women will continue to hide behind the shadow of their claims." Jonathan stood at the back of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the sisters with a heavy heart. He knew what was at stake. The truth, in all its brutality, had been revealed, but it was still up to the court and the town to decide what that truth meant. The first to speak was Elias Carter, Jonathan's trusted deputy. He had worked tirelessly with Jonathan to piece together the mystery. He stepped up to the witness stand, his hands slightly trembling as he began. "Sheriff Hale and I found evidence linking the Whitfords to the disappearances. We discovered items belonging to the victims buried near their property, including a watch that belonged to William Tate, one of the missing men." A murmur spread through the room at the mention of the watch, and Jonathan watched as Martha's eyes flicked momentarily to the floor. Her calm facade remained, but Jonathan could see the briefest flicker of something beneath. Regret? Guilt? He wasn't sure, but it made his stomach churn. Elias continued, "We also have witness testimonies from a man named Samuel Doyle, who claims he narrowly escaped the Whitford cabin. He reported being locked in a guest room and that the sisters acted suspiciously toward him. The evidence speaks for itself." The defense was quick to respond. Martha rose from her seat, her voice as steady as ever. "What you call evidence, Sheriff, is nothing more than hearsay and circumstantial. These men came through our home looking for shelter. We fed them, offered them rest. What they did after that is not our fault." The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Samuel Briggs, stood beside her. "We assert that the victims chose to disappear. They left of their own volition, or they met their fate at the hands of someone else. There is no concrete proof that my clients were involved in any crimes." Jonathan stood still, watching as the defense spun their web of words, but it was clear to him that the truth had already been laid bare. The townsfolk had seen the evidence, had heard the stories, and now it was their decision to make. After a few moments of silence, the judge called for a recess. The room emptied into the hall, where groups of townsfolk huddled in small clusters arguing fiercely. Some expressed their desire for the harshest punishment possible. Others, still holding on to their belief in the sisters' innocence, lobbied for leniency. Jonathan stood by the courtroom window, looking out over the town he had sworn to protect. The air was still, the hills beyond bathed in the amber glow of the afternoon sun. The trial was only the beginning. Whatever the verdict, the damage had already been done. The town had been forever changed. Even if Martha and Eliza were found guilty, the fractures they had created would remain long after the gavel fell. The question was, could the community heal, or would the scars of this dark chapter remain forever? The verdict came 3 days later, under a pale autumn sky. The courtroom was packed once more, but this time there was no whispering, no murmuring among the crowd. The tension was palpable, thick in the air as Judge Parker stood to deliver the decision that would change the town forever. The Whitford sisters sat in their seats, their faces unreadable, though Martha's eyes were locked in a steady, unwavering stare, as if bracing for the weight of the words about to be spoken. Jonathan stood at the back of the room, his hands folded in front of him. The case had been laid bare, testimonies, evidence, the confessions and the defense. There was no question about what had happened. Still, part of him had hoped that the town's final decision would be one of mercy, though he knew it was a naive wish. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Parker began, his voice steady. "And in accordance with the law of this land, I hereby pronounce the following. The defendants, Martha and Eliza Whitford, are found guilty of the crimes they are accused of: murder, kidnapping, and the illegal confinement of travelers who entered their home." A collective breath went through the room, followed by a low murmur. Some faces in the crowd softened, as though the weight of the verdict had finally sunk in. Others, the families of the victims, exhaled with a sense of finality. There would be no more uncertainty. "But," the judge continued, his voice growing heavier. "While the acts committed by these women are unforgivable, the circumstances under which they were driven to such actions cannot be ignored. The court will recommend a sentence of life in prison, but I leave the final determination to the council. It is not for me to say whether their punishment should be more or less. Let history decide their legacy." There was no uproar, no outcry from the crowd, only a heavy silence that seemed to blanket the entire room. Jonathan's heart ached. The verdict, while a form of justice, felt empty. There was no victory here, no true sense of closure. Outside the courtroom, the town gathered in tight-knit groups, some sharing quiet words of relief, others still too burdened by their own grief to speak. Jonathan walked slowly toward the steps of the courthouse, the weight of the trial still on his shoulders. He had done what was necessary, but it wasn't enough. There was still a part of him that wondered if he could have stopped it sooner, if he could have seen the danger before it grew so large. "Sheriff," came a voice behind him. He turned to see Clara Bennett, her face soft but full of concern. "You did what you had to do," she said, stepping up beside him. "No one else could have." "Not like you." Jonathan didn't reply at first, his eyes staring out across the town. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the buildings, and for a moment it seemed as though the hills themselves were mourning. "You ever think about what could have been?" Jonathan asked quietly. "If I had acted sooner, if we had known." Clara nodded slowly. "We all do. But the past can't be undone. All you can do is move forward." Her words hung in the air, and Jonathan let them settle in his mind. She was right, of course. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't go back and save the lost souls who had wandered into the Whitfords' home. But perhaps there was a future still worth fighting for, one that would heal the wounds that ran deep in the town. "Do you think they'll ever find peace?" he asked, looking at Clara. She hesitated. "Maybe, but peace is a hard thing to come by, and some things, Sheriff, don't get forgotten. Not ever." Jonathan nodded, his gaze drifting back to the hills that bordered the town. The shadows stretched long across the land, and he knew that the town's healing would be slow, its scars deep. But the people would survive. They had to. The hills that had once been full of whispers and rumors were now silent. The truth had been brought to light, but it had come at a great cost. Jonathan turned and walked back into the courthouse, his head held a little higher, though the weight of the world still pressed on his shoulders. The trial was over. The Whitford sisters had been sentenced. But the shadows they had cast over the town would take much longer to fade. And for Jonathan Hale, the scars of this dark chapter would remain with him forever, reminders of the cost of justice and the price of silence.